Oh, good afternoon. And thank you, Geneviève, for your very kind introduction, and above all, for your generous invitation to me to speak with you and your colleagues here in Ann Arbor. Thank you all very much for taking the time to come today. And especially I want to thank Nicole Housen for her care and patience in putting my trip together. I look forward to meeting many of you and to a discussion with you both about Bruno Schulz and his Galician milieu and about new directions for the fields of Polish and Jewish studies more generally. It would be impossible for me to overstate what a special and particular honor it is to be able to take part in your series of talks celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Copernicus lecture series. This occasion holds a personal meaning and also a special emotion for me because I've not been back to Crease and this campus since college, when I took my very first work-study job as an undergraduate in the Crease office. At that time, as a student of comparative literature in the residential college, I did not yet know that my life would take me the direction of Slavic studies. But the Copernicus lectures, and specifically Timothy Garton Ash's 1987 lecture on the Solidarity Movement, and Adam Michnik's 1989 lecture on the future of socialism in Eastern Europe would have a direct influence on the future direction that my life would take. On my decision to study the Solidarity Movement and the transition to democracy in Poland as an inspiring model of civil society and of the potential for peaceful democratic transformation of a society. Poland, since that time, has not stopped to offer a model for a society exploring the potential of democracy as a continual process of opening to new and increasingly inclusive narratives, national and also post-national, of which I know that Geneviève Zubrzycki has spoken to you in her discussion on the Jewish revival that has transformed narratives of Polishness and Jewishness in Poland. As it undertakes this process, Poland offers a model not only of democracy as a process of opening outward, but also of opening inward to allow the constitutive hybridity, which was always already a part of Polish history, society, and culture, to emerge. That complexity is gradually being revealed today in scholarship coming out of Poland, in cultural institutions and public discourse within Poland, brought to the surface like the layers of a palimpsest being revealed, written in at least 5 languages, including Yiddish, Hebrew, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and German. All of these, languages without which the Polish space of encounter cannot be fully understood or explored. For this reason, to talk about Poland today finally requires that we, colleagues from different philologically based departments, be in constant conversation across the linguistically defined boundaries of our departments: Jewish studies, Germanic languages and literatures, and Slavic literatures. In my research, I am interested in this aspect of Polish culture as a multilingual space of encounter and in exploring the formal strategies by which narratives and also critical texts work to create precisely spaces of openness, hybrid, unfinalizable, or aporetic figures that function to challenge existing paradigms, to reveal the limitations of existing vocabularies, and to create spaces of encounter. Certainly, this is a project in which the texts and also graphic works of Galician Jewish modernist writer Bruno Schulz were involved. Art, wrote Schulz in a 1935 essay for S.I. Witkiewicz, by virtue of its being a spontaneous utterance of life, places a demand on ethics and not vice versa. Were art merely to affirm what has already been established, it would be superfluous. The role of art is to be a probe, lowered into the realm of the nameless, zapuszczona w bezimienne. The artist is a device for registering those submerged processes by which values are shaped into life. Schulz proposes here, and his stories bear this out, that he's interested in developing forms of modern art that explore territories or regions that have not yet been named or claimed. Further, this exploratory work in the unnamed, unclaimed regions is explicitly understood as an ethical project. Art in the irresponsible, impulsive, or immature spontaneity of its utterance, and in generating an encounter with that which is not yet known or owned, which is entirely other, is not responding to ethics, but rather posing new challenges to ethics, pulling ethics forward. Existing criticism of Schulz does not treat him as a politically engaged writer, as a man engaged in any political project of his intensely political time. But this forward impulse that he would attribute to art, toward and into the unknown, speaks to his artistic drive to stage an encounter with the radically other, and to create textual spaces that remain open to the other. And in this aspect, Schulz's aesthetic philosophy is closely in line with the concept of messianicité, or messianicity, developed by Jacques Derrida. Messianicity appears as a salvaging, a recuperation for secular thought, and in Schulz's case, for the secular modernist text, of the ethical impulse within Jewish tradition that keeps it, as Derrida would have it, turned toward the future and open to the unknown. Writes Derrida, quotes, "Well, what remains irreducible to any deconstruction is perhaps a certain experience of the emancipatory promise. It is perhaps even the formality of a structural messianism, a messianism without religion, even a messianic without messianism, an idea of justice, which we distinguish from law or right or even from human rights, and an idea of democracy, which we distinguish from its determined predicates today." End quotes. Derrida's work on messianicité and his exploration of the concept of writing in the third language offer critical tools and vocabulary to elucidate the quiet political work to which Schulz's aesthetics applies itself. This is true because both writers, Schulz and Derrida, both of them philosophers of language, grapple with a common problem, namely, how to create or honor a relationship of inheritance with respect to Jewish tradition without participating in the boundary drawing gesture of nationalism. Schulz's aesthetics of openness, hybridity, evasion or escape, and encounter, all of these which I consider elements that contribute to Schulz's writing in the third language, explore strategies for preserving the messianicity offered by or contained within Jewish tradition. And again, with Derrida's help, this can be described in terms of experience rather than specific content, as an orientation toward an unrealizable future that contains the possibility of dignity, even for a Jewish writer in the Polish language in post-World War I, post-imperial Central Europe, while at the same time resisting participation in the competing articulations of Jewish nationalism that shaped much of Jewish secular intellectual life for Schulz's generation, whether it be diaspora nationalism, cultural Zionism, or political Zionism, or even Polish patriotism, and the competing proposals for national literatures that were integral to these political and cultural programs, in Yiddish, Hebrew, or Polish, respectively. Schulz's work as an affirmatively Jewish writer in the Polish language, not exploring characteristically themes of Polish Jewish literature as identified by Prokop Janiec, Polish Jewish literature being literature by Jewish writers in Polish that specifically addressed and dealt with Jewish themes. Also not the focus of his modernist experimentation. Schulz, not belonging to these groups, could not and does not belong to any one of the distinct national language literatures defined in this period of competing nationalisms. On the contrary, his works resist the impulse to contribute to a national project in an aesthetic gesture that echoes the fear shared by religious Jews who saw political Zionism as an unrealizable and blasphemous attempt to secularize Messianism. In Schulz's work, this anxiety mixes with an elitist fear of mass political movements and a strong post-imperial nostalgia for the Austrian Empire or the universal idea of the Austrian Empire. Schulz explores this challenge and problem in the oniric parable from which his second collection of short stories took its title, The Sanatorium Under the Sign of the Hourglass. It might be a different page 5. Yeah, there are 2 printouts maybe. The story, dominated by an uncharacteristic mood of anxiety and dark foreboding, turns on a central conceit. The father, Joseph, a character who in Schulz's short stories represents Jewish tradition, and also specifically Jewish prophetic and literary tradition, has already passed away in his own country. But his family has given him into the care of the management of the sanatorium under the sign of the hourglass, where experts have devised a method of keeping him alive, suspended in a kind of pseudo-life after death, a, quote, pitiful substitute for life, an eerily empty simulacrum of the life he had lived. Is my father alive? Asked the protagonist. Yes, of course, answers Dr. Guittard. That is, within the limits imposed by the situation. You know as well as I that from the point of view of your home, from the perspective of your own country, your father is dead. This cannot be entirely remedied. That death throws a certain shadow on his existence here. Dr. Guittard's reanimation project is possible only through an effort of willful self-delusion on the part of the community. Quotes, "It is clear that only by the solidarity of forbearance, by a communal averting of the eyes from the obvious and shocking shortcomings of his condition, could this pitiful semblance of life maintain itself. The slightest doubt could undermine it, the faintest breeze of skepticism destroy it. Could Dr. Guittard's sanatorium provide for father this hothouse atmosphere of friendly indulgence and guard him from the cold winds of sober analysis?" It was astonishing that in this insecure and questionable state of affairs, father was capable of behaving so admirably. The story's protagonist, Joseph, who functions as a literary alter ego for Schulz in many of his stories, visits his father at the sanatorium under the sign of the hourglass out of concern for his welfare and to find out if they have sent him into good hands. He increasingly doubts the wisdom of his family's decision. The sanatorium is eerily empty and the doctor seemingly absent and untrustworthy, and, as will become decisive to the story, Joseph discovers that the entire sanatorium is guarded by a vicious creature, half man, half dog, from whom he will flee for his life at the end of the story, not knowing whether his father will return to his room to be devoured by the desperate and vicious creature. Quotes, "I begin to regret this whole undertaking. Perhaps we were misled by skillful advertising when we decided to send father here. I sometimes feel a strong desire to open each door wide and leave it ajar, so that the miserable intrigue in which we have got ourselves involved can be exposed. I would draw," end quote. "I would draw your attention in that final line to the emphasis on openness." Schulz's Kafkaesque parable, also reminiscent of a Nachman of Bratslav tale, is structured to invite multiple interpretations, and I invite you to intervene with your own in the discussion session. But for the present argument, I will treat the story as an exploration of the uneasy afterlife of Jewish literature and tradition in a modern secular age. More specifically, the afterlife of the Jewish textual and interpretive tradition, and the ethos or premise of openness contained within it, its messianic promise, in a secular age characterized by the solidification of distinct national literatures, including both modern Yiddish and modern Hebrew literatures. The titular sanatorium invites the protagonist's father in under the sign of the hourglass, clepsydra, a symbol of death and also itself an obituary notice, signaling that the sanatorium is a mausoleum, and the Jewish exegetical and prophetic tradition that enters here already a cadaver. The figure of the dead father is treated with anxious, respectful concern and love by the protagonist, and ignored, undernourished, and left in a perpetual slumber by the management. The image of the hourglass contains within it also a suggestion of the possibility of resurrection in its reversibility. So the parable conceals the question of whether and how Jewish literature or tradition may live again. But more directly, the tale warns that the father will be devoured by the dogman of nationalism that the management has tied out front to guard the sanatorium. The plot turns on Joseph's negotiation with this dogman, who Joseph describes in this way. I cite, "The management of the sanatorium keeps an enormous Alsatian on a chain, a terror of a beast, a werewolf of truly demoniacal ferocity. I shiver with fear whenever I pass his kennel. He does not bark, but his wild face contorts at the sight of a human being. He stiffens with an expression of boundless fury, and slowly raising his horrible muzzle, breaks into a low, fervent, convulsive howl that comes from the very depths of his hatred, a howl of despair and lament of his temporary impotence." End quote. Attempting to befriend the terrifying dogman, once again the impulse toward the encounter with the radically other figures centrally in this story, the protagonist realizes that he is in fact a human being, but a desperate, penniless worker who has clearly been associated with political pamphleteering, with ink on his fingers. The implications being that these are the servants roped out of desperation into doing nationalism's dirty work. Hoping to engage with the man in a civilized fashion, the protagonist accidentally ends up leading the dogman directly into his father's bedroom. Realizes that he is in deadly danger and flees for his life out of the walls of the sanatorium, off the grounds, and straight onto a moving train. The ending of the tale suggests that Schulz's parable potentially makes a proposal in favor of diasporism as the only hope for a living Jewish literature. And that line could be pursued. But rather than try to resolve the riddle, I would like to focus on the contrast proposed between a space of enclosure, the sanatorium, and a space of openness, the moving train. Windows open, wind moving through the cars. The story fears the suffocating closure of the mausoleum sanatorium, a bounded territory guarded by nationalism, or its political program. More threatening in this portrayal to its inhabitants, its patients, than to the outside world. The strategy the story proposes for survival is one of escape. Again, the text must flee beyond established boundaries, outside of territories that were established for the very purpose of preserving the father's life. Specifically, the parable speaks powerfully to the anxiety and alienation felt by a Polish language writer, a Galician Jewish writer, exploring the potential for Jewish literature in the historical context of the intense and even vicious language wars that characterized the Jewish literary world of the early 20th century, in particular following the 1908 Chernovitz Conference. Specifically, projects to create national Jewish literatures in both Hebrew and Yiddish. Literary projects that were connected respectively to the political programs of Zionism and diaspora nationalism. Either, or rather both of these programs, designated itself the appropriate inheritor of the Jewish literary tradition and proposed to take the legacy of traditional Jewish culture into its care as a ward. Benjamin Harshav places the context of what he calls the modern Jewish language. Benjamin Harshav places the modern Jewish language revolution in the context of competing or parallel tracks of movement into modernity within the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. Harshav proposes a dualistic model that sees writers forced to make a choice between two opposing routes into Jewish literary modernity. Quotes, "The movement went in two directions," he writes, "extrinsic and intrinsic. In other words, either go to the center of culture, in both the physical and spiritual sense, master its language, literature, ideologies, behavior, and science, and become a member of that language community, German, Russian, English." Interestingly, Harshav does not include Polish here. This will change with time. Or, to continue the quote, "create a parallel culture in Jewish languages, Yiddish and modern Hebrew, that would have similar genres, norms, ideas, institutions, and achievements. Through either of those, you join cosmopolitan European culture as a whole." End quote. Characteristically, Schulz and his work do not fit into the dichotomy presented by Harshav. To borrow language offered by Homi Bhabha, Schulz's work represents instead a literary third space, a third space of literature between existing paradigms. "Hybridity to me is the third space," writes Homi Bhabha, "which enables other positions to emerge. This third space displaces the histories that constitute it and sets up new structures of authority, new political initiatives which are inadequately understood through received wisdom. Bruno Schulz's work represents an attempt to forge a literary third space for modern Jewish art within a contested cultural terrain, and it has awaited the present growing interest in transnational and supranational spaces of cultural expression. Resisting incorporation into a given national literature, Schulz's aesthetic landscapes can be read as a post-imperial space of Galician Jewish nostalgia resistance. Indeed, Schulz's work represents a bold attempt to bring Galician Jewish culture and literary traditions into the center of a newly emerging modern Polish culture. So, not to leave Jewish culture and tradition through assimilation into the newly emerging center of Polish modernism, but to bring Galician Jewish culture into the center of an emerging multicultural Polish society after World War I. In part, this entails imagining or trying to will into existence a multicultural, multi-ethnic Polish republic that would welcome that vision, one that would reproduce or protect elements of the former Austrian Empire that was longed for nostalgically by some Galician Jews. This longing and this cultural imaginary are in evidence in the essays that Schulz wrote on the occasion of Józef Pilsudski's death in 1936. Among the only publications or surviving documents of any kind that show Schulz openly engaging a contemporary political matter, these essays recall strongly the language of Franz Werfel's paean to Emperor Franz Joseph and to the Austrian Empire in Twilight of a World. Writes Werfel, "The soil of Austria has a mysterious humus-forming power. Whole peoples and races whose footprints she bears become like the fallen leaves of last year's autumn. She took them all into herself and changed them into something new. Austria was a home of humanity without regard to blood or confession, to origin or goal of its children. the Austrian born in Old Austria has no longer a home. In the imagery of Schulz's work, with the interesting exception of the final train scene at the end of Sanatorium under the sign of the hourglass, the future of homelessness is substituted by that of openness and abundance. Constitutively hybrid because produced at the post-World War I Galician intersection of German, Polish, and Jewish cultures, Schulz's literary and artistic work also seeks to discover or open up a territory between materialism and theology, to allow his readers to glimpse, like the blurred and blurring figure drawn in the air by a juggler, a space of potentiality between existing formulas. It is once again in and through this third space that Schulz's works succeed in placing a persistent demand on ethics. Turning once again to Jacques Derrida for language that seeks to describe the kind of textual work that Schulz's narratives undertake, I have described Schulz's work as an attempt at writing in the third language, a concept that he describes that desires to open a space within the space of a text between theology and materialism, between sacred and secular, that keeps open an intimation or frisson of the sacred while leaving it unnamed. Once again, in Schulz's work, as in Derrida's, the negotiation of a third language that allows the text to become a passage between sacred and secular is always also a search for a use of language and textual form between Jewish tradition and modern secular universalism. Schulz's entire oeuvre, including short stories, essays, and graphic works, is characterized by a many-faced gesture of playful refusal, resistance, and charlatanry, built of literary stagecraft and changing masks, designed to frustrate categorization. It refuses to speak with unambiguously Jewish words, but it refuses outright to abandon its Jewishness. Against the grain of a majority of Jewish art in its time, it seeks a repertoire of images and changing masks that contain both and, rather than either or, Jewish, non-Jewish, sacred, secular. Implied is that only such a charlatanism and sleight of hand could attempt to honor the lived reality. Schulz was a Galician Jewish artist raised in a multicultural city within the Austrian Empire, Drohobych, with a population of Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, the majority either Hasidic or Zionist, although Schulz was neither. His major literary influences came through German and Austrian literature, Rilke, Mann, and Kafka, and his artistic sensibilities took shape in Vienna, both before and during World War I. Growing up in a family that chose to use Polish in the home, he was educated in both Polish and German, attended Polish gymnasium, and would choose to write in the Polish language, feeling it was in this language that he could fully exercise his originality. But as soon as they are written, his texts already felt trapped to him, and they longed to escape the edifice of the Polish language and of Polish literature, and to run for the train. Quotes, "I'd very much like to capture that prize." He's speaking to Romana Halpern about the prestigious Wiadomości Literackie Award, a leading Warsaw literary prize, chiefly because it is the stepping stone by which to break through the boundaries of the Polish language. Schulz would long for an international readership and for a, quotes, common platform of humanism, a stockpile and court of appeals to which individuals of different cultures could resort. And here again, Schulz's language resonates with the sense of appeal and a desire for justice and for recognition. The Republic of Dreams, evoked in myriad forms throughout his stories and essays, proposed a textual space for such a court of appeals, imagined as no man's land and God's land, an open space where national boundaries expire. Quotes, "In those far-off days, our gang of boys hit on the outlandish and impossible notion of straying even further, beyond that inn, into no man's or God's land, of patrolling borders both disputed and neutral, where boundary lines petered out and the compass roll of the winds skittered erratically under a high-arching sky." Schulz's aesthetic project, then, involves an interest in creating spaces immune to the call of nationalism and of little help in the construction of any national canon. Undoubtedly, for Jewish modernist writers in Poland, America, and Russia who made the choice to write in Yiddish, like Schulz's colleague and lover, Deborah Vogel, Schulz would have seemed as irrelevant to the project of creating a distinctive and affirmative modern Jewish culture and literature as the Austrian Jewish playwright Franz Werfel. Addressing the problem of multilingualism in Jewish literature, leading Yiddish literary critic H. Levick wrote, quotes, I will be even clearer. Should our Yiddish Hebrew literature exist only through, for example, a Bialik or a Peretz, no one else, we would have the full right to say that we have a national literature. However, should we not have any literature in Yiddish or in Hebrew, even were we to have 50 Heinos and 50 Werfels, and here we can read 50 Schulzes, we would have nothing from a national standpoint. This is our literature a bi or a multilingual literature? From the perspective of a renewed scholarly interest in supranational and hybrid cultural imaginaries, however, we may now see in Schulz's works a concerted attempt to explore the potential relevance, vitality, and necessity of Jewish tradition for his own modernist aesthetics, while at the same time refusing to connect that engagement with tradition to Jewish nationalism, whether of the Zionist or the Yiddishist variety. In the time that remains, I would like to take a moment to look at formal elements. That is something that I am interested to explore that make up writing in the third language. So how does one create this space, this in-between space? What kind of figures are these hybrid, grotesque, or aporetic spaces within literature? A key strategy of Schulz's written and graphic work involves the use of devices including visual elements and narrative asides that give formal expression to the concept of hybridity as a constitutive principle. I have one picture to show you. Here it comes. An important example involves the creation of visual and linguistic grotesques that combine contradictory elements, Jewish and Catholic, male and female, human and animal, sacred and profane, into one figure. Within Schulz's work, often such a figure, be it conceptual or concrete, contains a pair of contrasting elements that encounter one another and that function like a Mobius strip, becoming versions of one another within the space of the artwork and revealing their mutual inseparability, their emergence in and through one another. And by extension, we may say through their constitutive other. It is interesting to note, actually, that Bruno Schulz's own name that combines a Polish first name with a Jewish last name offers a prototype for these characteristic hybrid grotesque elements. While Schulz's older brother Isidor originally had a Jewish given name, Israel Baruch, Bruno Schulz's parents did not give him one. And so I would like to focus now on one example of this type of hybrid grotesque, the figure that turns the holy writ or sacred text into the sexualized female form and vice versa. So it contrasts the elements holy writ, female form. In June of 1930, several years before he began to publish his written works, Schulz's artwork was featured in the Yiddish cultural journal Zusteier, published in Lemberg, Lvov. The goal of the journal's founders and editors, who included Deborah Vogel, Rochel Auerbach, and Rochel Korn, and Melech Ravitch, was to identify and cultivate a distinctive Jewish Galician culture, to promote modernist Jewish art of Galicia, and literature and criticism in the Yiddish language. Quotes, "May this second issue of Zusteier be a demonstration of our will and perseverance," write the editors in an opening note from the June 1930 issue in which Schulz's works were featured. "One of the signs of the cultural vitality and engagement of Jewish, also read Yiddish, Galicia." Karolina Szymaniak's pioneering study of Deborah Vogel's literary criticism, Być agentem wiecznej idei, details Vogel's efforts, together with Auerbach and Korn, to promote modern Yiddish culture in Lemberg through the creation of Zusteier. In her fascinating study of Vogel's aesthetics, Szymaniak explores the decision by Vogel, who, like Schulz, was a Galician Jewish writer and critic, raised in the Polish language and most comfortable writing in that language, to undertake the difficult project of adopting Yiddish and turning herself into a Yiddish language writer. Indeed, Vogel's choice can be seen as an alternate version and an alternate solution to the same artistic challenge that faced Schulz, that of creating a secular modernist art in Poland that married Jewishness with universalism. Szymaniak writes that Vogel's decision to adopt Yiddish as her creative language represented a radical resolution of the dilemma of the Polish writer outlined by Eugenia Prokopianiec. Vogel returned to the sphere of native Jewish languages, to the Yiddish language, neither choosing the first road, assimilation, nor negating the last one, nationalist art. She was able to gain complete thematic and more widely aesthetic freedom without sacrificing the Jewishness that was central to her work and her identity. For Vogel, this was a chance to realize an artistic program that was far removed from typical Polish Jewish themes, but was at the same time a clear declaration of her Jewish identity. It was, in this sense, a resolution of the fundamental dilemma of modernism described by Włodzimierz Balecki as the tension between universalism and specificity, lokalność. Precisely this negotiation between commitment to Jewish culture as a distinct modern culture and commitment to universal humanism energizes Bruno Schulz's work, and these thematics are explored in the graphic works by Schulz that Vogel and her co-editors chose to include in the 1930 issue of Zusteyer. Reproductions of 3 cliché-Ver prints by B. Schulz, and it's interesting that in the Yiddish language text where they're promoting a Jewish Galician culture, they did not give his Polish first name. I wish we could ask. Reproductions of the 3 cliché-Ver prints by B. Schulz appeared in the issue. Karlikus or Dorfs, Undelafschen Spazier, Undla taking a walk, and a Begegnish, an encounter. A sketch that features 2 boys wearing coats that seem to waver between Hasidic kaftans and women's overcoats, and wide-brimmed hats. The boys are encountering or observing 2 provocatively dressed women who seem to pose on a platform in the streets of a town, placing themselves open to the boys' evaluation, interpretation, like works of art to be studied. In this very early version, this early iteration of the Encounter series, as in many of Schulz's graphic works and also stories, these contrasting elements, the book or scroll, Talmud or Torah, or in this case, students of Talmud, on the one hand. So in other versions of the Encounter series, it will actually be a book or a Talmud student or yeshiva bocher reading a book. Here they become versions of each other. Here we have just the students as the students of Torah on the one hand, and on the other, the female form, dressed or undressed, become versions of one another in a representational gesture that explores provocatively, playfully, ironically, and also unironically the relationship between the twin concepts of idolatry and the Word made flesh, testing their barely discernible boundaries. Schulz's exploration of the dialectical relationship between sacred and profane, between the Holy Writ and the modern material world that lies available to interpretation by the artist exegete, also engages a question of central interest to modernist Jewish artists of the period, whether they were working in Yiddish, Russian, Polish, German, or English. And it is the same question adopted by Derrida in his explorations of the third language. Namely, what is the legacy and the relevance of the concept of Torah or Holy Writ to the secular modernist artist and the modern guardian or inheritor of Jewish literature? Is the book to remain a dead shell and simulacrum of the former living and breathing body of the Torah? Or is the hourglass to be turned and a living text to be glimpsed as it flies up from the pages and disappears? Schulz's common image here throughout his stories is of sparrows flying up from the pages of the text, or a cabbage rose opening to reveal a chattering nest of birds. These are versions of Schulz's text on the run, already escaped into the material world. The gesture of attempting a profane or secular, and hence transgressive, recasting of the Torah or Talmud, and I'm going to step back and it's too summary, my skipping over what happens in these pictures. The set of iterations of the encounter, and there are dozens of them by Schulz, explore the possibility that if there is a corollary to the sacred Holy Writ, it has become projected into the material world, and the secular modernist artist reading the world, interpreting it, and transforming it into his modernist art is the version of an exegete, a Torah scholar, who carries on the spirit of openness implied by the Jewish exegetical tradition. And so here, the text being read is the body of the women, the exegetes are the boys, but what's interesting is how very much they become each other. So the faces of the further back person in each pair match each other with lips and eyebrows. The men are feminized. The feet match each other with the pointing toes and the delicate legs. So the implication being that the Holy Writ cannot exist without its movement through the sacred, the profane world, and vice versa. So they become a Mobius strip in which they are necessarily intertwined with each other. And then the implied gesture that the modernist artist achieves is grasping or intuiting a moment of that messianicity that's implied. The gesture of attempting a profane or secular and hence transgressive recasting of the Torah or Talmud was a familiar trope within the Jewish intellectual and artistic world of independent Poland. Quotes, "Why shouldn't we put together and canonize a second Jewish book of books," wrote Melech-Ravitch, leader of the Chaliastra group of avant-garde Yiddish poets based in Warsaw in the late 1930s. "Now the times are freer, more open to ideas about a second Bible, which do keep coming up. The canonized Bible is over 2,000 years old, and a great deal has happened since then." End quotes. Ravitch proposed that the new Torah include the works of Spinoza, Bergson, and Karl Marx, as well as the parables of Jesus, the first reformer of Jewish law. "Who should put the second Bible together?" he asks. "I don't know. I don't even dare to want to know. It would be best if someone suddenly appeared, a little-known man with a considerable knowledge. No one may call the man and appoint him. He must do it on his own. He must be a man without a name, or at least a man whose name is of little concern to him." Ravitch's proposals resonate strongly with Schulz's experimentation in the possibilities of the open-ended text as the inheritor of the Holy Writ. I would like to return in closing to the Sanatorium under the sign of the hourglass. Schulz's story interests me in particular in the present context, that of the Copernicus lectures, which invite us to consider the changes that the field of Polish studies has undergone over the decades following the achievements of solidarity and the transition to democracy. In the last 20 years, Polish institutions have moved far ahead of our own academic departments to open and turn inside out the texts and the narratives of Polish culture. How are we, as the institutional caretakers of Polish studies, responding to the opening, to the removal of nationally, ethnically, and linguistically defined boundaries within the sphere of Polish culture? Borders erected for the express purpose of keeping Polish culture alive on life support throughout decades of communism, and that are no longer needed. Reading Schulz's parable, are we invited to think of departments of Polish language and literature as so many sanatoria under the sign of the hourglass, established to house and care however lovingly for the cadaver of a national Polish literary canon? Indeed, Schulz's uneasy suspicion of nationalism as an edifice for literature and his creation of a body of work that would neither belong to nor fit within any one nationally bounded cultural space resonates with the present-day growth in scholarly interest in post-national and transnational approaches to the study of culture, including post-imperial studies and models that emphasize cultural hybridity. What would our institutional corollary to the figures of the encounter, escape, and openness to the other proposed by a constitutively hybrid text like Schulz's be? Scholarship, after all, like literature, has its eyes turned toward the as yet unarticulated horizons of justice. It has never satisfied itself with taking care of the past. Our national literary canons, when they were created, were full of hope. Schulz reminds us of two strategies: escape and inversion. In the first, we run from the old model and create new spaces for scholarship, created between our departments or through cooperation that allow our graduate students to minor in different subjects, and that may take material from various cultural traditions with them into those new scholarly spaces. In the second, inversion, we turn our own fields, which were defined along national and linguistic lines, inside out, and discover their internal hybridity. Poland as a culture has already started to do this, and it has enormous material with which to work. What would it mean for us in an academic setting? First of all, it would mean turning Polish studies into a multilingual space, with immediate ramifications for course requirements and language requirements and cross-listing. It would mean requiring more work and specifically more languages of our graduate students. A degree in Polish studies means specifically the choice to enter a multilingual space of encounter and to maximize the scholarly and comparative potential that that allows. Just as to major in Slavic studies previously required Russian and a second Slavic language, the new major in Polish studies should require Polish language, at least one Jewish language, and either German, Ukrainian, or Russian. The environment for this type of scholarship has long existed in Russia and Ukraine, but it is only now taking shape in Poland, as a new generation of Polish scholars are graduating with a knowledge of Polish, Yiddish, and Hebrew, the three major print languages of interwar Poland. This is only one example, and I'd be delighted to discuss others during our question session. It also means rebuilding from scratch a curriculum of Polish literature and culture courses such that they reflect the multicultural environment in which cultural trends unfolded from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth on down. A standard question on the exam with respect to any text read in a Polish literature class should be, what language was it written in? I will close here by leaving the door open to your input, your ideas and criticisms. And I want only to emphasize in closing what an honor it is for me to have the opportunity to speak with you and think together about the future of our fields. Thank you so much.